Okie dokie. I have 1 o'clock by my watch, and that's good enough for me. Ooh, I'm echoey. Echo. All right. My name is MC Williams. I'm the host of the Myths Your Teacher Hated podcast. It's a not so family friendly podcast telling the stories of mythology and folklore from around the world with all the fun bits left in. Today's panel, being that it's before 10 p.m., will be family friendly. So I want to make sure there's no misunderstandings about the podcast because that would be unfortunate. Before we get started, I do want to plug our charity this year, Open Hands. They are a fantastic organization. They provide food and services for the needy around the Atlanta area. We've got the bucket set up here. If you've got a little bit extra change you want to drop in, that would be fantastic. They are a great organization and well worth supporting. I also want to make sure we thank Blueberry, who is our sponsor for our streams today and have been a sponsor for a while. They're really fantastic. And you can follow us on Twitch at DC Digital Media. I believe this panel is actually on there, so hi. So I've been doing this panel for a few years now, and it's always cool to see people actually show up for it. I'm never sure. But this is going to be the 6-year podiversary for the podcast in like a week and a half now, so I'm really excited about this. This year, we are talking about a tale as old as time, a song as old as rhyme, the classic French tale, La Belle et la Bête, or of course, Beauty and the Beast. As you can probably guess, spoilers abound for the 1991 animated film and the 2017 live-action remake. If you haven't seen it by now, too bad. This romantic duo came roaring back into the public consciousness with the 1991 animated classic from Disney. It was a massive hit and even became the first animated feature film to be nominated for Best Pictures at the Oscars. It lost out to Silence of the Lambs, but did take home the gold for Best Original Song in '92. And this year marks the 30th anniversary of that particular achievement, and so Disney is deciding to produce a live television hybrid event that's going to mix the animated scenes with some live action, some new songs, some original songs. It's going to be a really cool event, and so I figured this was a very timely time to talk about Beauty and the Beast. Like many of the classic animated films, Beauty and the Beast draws from the classic fairy tale for its story. And also, like most of them, the movie takes a lot of liberties. For a lot of mythology and folklore, it's impossible to nail down a true original version. Stories like Hercules, which I've talked about before, draw from the many versions of the oral tradition, which all have different stories that were developed independently in different regions and tell the story differently, and all of them are valid, and they are very contradictory. In this case, we do actually have a solid, nailed-down version for the specific original. It was published in 1740 by French novelist Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. Try saying that 5 times fast. It's a long, complicated story that was abridged into something approaching the more familiar version in 1756 by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont. Of course, de Villeneuve did draw heavily on the much older stories, which does muddy the water a little. Specifically, you get the tales of Cupid and Psyche from Greek mythology, and you get the Italian folklore tale, The Pig King. If you're here today, I can assume you probably know the basic plot of the Disney movie, but the older story is a little bit less well known. I'm not going to get into the full version because it is long. It took about 8 episodes to cover in full. It is, there's a reason they cut it down because it's a lot of stuff you really don't need background for characters you don't care about. But it is interesting, and some of it does play into the choices they ended up making for the animated version. So, for a very quick synopsis of the original tale, once upon a time, a widower and his 12 children lived in Paris. All of his daughters were beautiful, but the youngest was known as Belle, which means beauty, since she was the most beautiful of them all, which seems kind of rude. Even better, she was kind, well-read, and pure of heart, unlike her cruel, selfish, spoiled, and very, very jealous older sisters. The merchant loses everything due to fire, storms at sea, and pirates. The guy just cannot catch a break, forcing the family to move to a small cottage in the woods several hundred miles outside of Paris. After living like this for several years, news arrives that one of the missing ships has arrived unexpectedly. He has to rush to claim it before his former business partners and supposed friends steal it all. Before he leaves, he asks his daughters what he can bring them back from the city. The elder daughters all demand expensive jewels, fancy dresses, things he can't possibly afford without spending all of the money he's hoping to get, and then some. But Belle realizes that her sisters are doing the impossible and asks only for a single rose because they don't grow out here where they're out in the wild. So she would love to have a free rose you can just pluck and not pay anything for. Isn't that great? By the time he arrives, all of the goods have been seized and sold. He spends 6 months wrangling with the legal system, trying to get it back, and sort of wins, but spends so much on legal fees that pretty much all of it is gone. So he ends up deciding he better get out of here before he spends everything and comes back poorer than he left, which unfortunately means he now has to go in the middle of winter, which is not great. Yeah. It's a very bad time to be riding through the wilderness. The poor merchant gets abused and gets caught in a terrible storm and gets lost. He stumbles across a mysterious castle, and as one does, he goes inside, but finds it empty and abandoned. Now, to his credit, in the original story and the live action remake, he does come in and ask for the host. He's trying to find people. He really is trying to be a good guest. In the original story, he falls asleep before he can find anybody before a nice fire that's clearly been set out for him because no one else is around, and wakes up to find a table set out in front of him covered with all the fanciest foods that you can imagine. And again, it wasn't there when he left, it's here now, so it's reasonable to assume it's been set out for him. So he eats, and he still hasn't found anyone else in the castle. And by this point, he knows his classical mythology, and he's starting to think about the story of Cupid and Psyche. They directly reference it. Whereas if you don't know that story, this temple of Psyche, Psyche goes to the temple of Cupid, where she is waited on by invisible servants. So he's assuming, well, maybe this is a castle that should belong to somebody, but no one's here. So maybe this is my castle and my invisible servants. So he resolves to move his family into this fabulous castle. On the way out, he passes a spectacular rose garden and stops off to get Belle a rose because he can actually get one of his daughters something, and she's the good one, so let's get her something. He picks the most beautiful one from the bush and is immediately confronted by a hideous beast. Disney's version of the beast is huge and rage-fueled, but still somehow relatable. I can't be the only one who thought he looked better as the beast than as a human in the animated version. The OG beast is not. He is a jumbled mishmash of different animals who sewn together wrong, with a long scaly trunk, huge tusks, fang, mismatched claws from different animals, feather, fur, you name it. If it's on an animal, he's got it. So this is his mysterious host, and he's furious that the merchant would steal from him after being given food, a place to sleep, a nice fire. And so, yeah, this is a violation of the ancient principles of guest right, a concept that was taken very seriously in the ancient world. And so the beast sentences him to death. Not imprisonment, death. The merchant begs for his life, explaining that he meant no harm. He simply wanted to take a rose back for his beautiful daughter, who has gone through this whole horrible thing. And the beast hears beautiful daughter and perks right up. So, beautiful daughter, huh? Okay, fine. I'll let you live, but only if you bring one of those daughters back here of her own free will, knowing that she's coming to her own execution to take your place. And the merchant is like, no, I'm not going to do that. Of course I'm not going to do that. But you're going to give me 30 days. So I'll go home, I'll get my affairs in order, and then I'll come back. I won't even tell them. It'll be fine. Except when he gets there, all of his family knows something is wrong. And by everyone I mean Belle, because everyone else is just mad he didn't bring back dresses. And she eventually gets the whole story out of him and, of course, immediately volunteers that she'll go in his place. Her brothers do, in this case she does have 6 brothers, try instead to take his place and go, oh, no, we'll go, and one of us will fight the beast and we'll probably die, but at least we'll die and not the patriarch of the family. But the beast was very specific that it had to be a daughter, not a son. So given the beast had warned him that if he tried to renege on his deal, he was going to murder him, his family, everyone he ever loved, everyone he was ever related to, and anyone he ever talked to on the street, he decides that's not a great idea. So he has 1 month to say goodbye, and eventually Belle does convince him to let her go with him. And then as soon as they set out, he starts to regret that and spends the whole ride trying to convince her to, no, it's not too late. You can go back. You don't have to do this. But she insists. The merchant is eventually sent home with huge chests full of dresses and riches for the family, leaving Belle alone with her executioner. Only he doesn't kill her, but serves her dinner. They quickly fall into routine. Belle spends her days alone exploring the huge magical castle full of all kinds of incredible wonders before eating with the beast. Every dinner is exactly the same. He asks her the same questions, and she gives the same answers. He asks her to go to bed with him. She says no. He leaves. End of day. And then the next day, the same thing happens all over again. But during a night, she has dreams where she wanders the castle grounds and meets this beautiful prince, who she comes to realize is also a prisoner of the beast somewhere on the castle grounds. And she's made it her mission to find this prince and save him. They meet each other in their dreams every night through some magic of the castle, and they quickly fall in love. Belle becomes homesick after several months of living alone with the beast. She tries to hide her depression from the beast, who she's come to realize is a nice, if very stupid man. But he notices and agrees to let her visit her home for 2 months, and warns her, not in a threatening way, but in a simply, this is what's going to happen way, that if she doesn't come back, she shouldn't come back at all because he'll be dead. He gives her a magic ring to take her safely back home if she wants to come back. And she heads off to see her family. Oop, wrong way. Her sisters are terrible to her. As much as they were all like, oh, our dear sweet Belle, what a great daughter she was, to all the people who are now hitting on them because they're a little bit rich again, as soon as she comes back, they hate her again. So she loses track of the time trying to help them plan their weddings. All of their suitors immediately fall in love with her instead, and it's a real problem. And she doesn't like this because they're obviously just after money and after the fact that she's hot. So she tries to, no, you really do love them. And it's a whole thing. It's a whole side plot that really gets lost in the weeds and no one cares. So she eventually does, on exactly 2 months. She gets another mysterious dream with this strangely regal woman she's never seen before, who tells her that the beast is dying and she needs to go back, like now. So she does. She comes back and she finds him in finds the beast in a cave that she has dreamed of before, behind a bunch of thorns. She has to dig her way through the thorns, taking a lot of little scratches and bloody marks to get to him where he is lying there. And she revives him barely, and he agrees that since she came back for him, he'll live for her. The next night, when he asks his usual dinner questions and gets around to asking her to go to bed with him, she says, sure, but only if we're married first. They don't have anyone else there, so they just kind of say it out loud and call it good enough and go to bed. She's understandably a little afraid of the wedding night, but the beast just climbs into bed and falls asleep. The next morning, she wakes up to find the beast gone and her handsome prince lying next to her, completely asleep and utterly unable to be awoken. She decides this is some sort of magic spell, tries a couple things to make that go away. It doesn't. She figures it'll go away on its own, and goes and wanders. And she finds a carriage arriving with the women from her dreams suddenly appearing outside. One turns out to be the queen, mother of the prince, and the other turns out to be a fairy, because yes, there is also a fairy in the original story. A series of tests and revelations ensue, as well as a huge, very complicated and needless backstory. We find out that the queen doesn't want her son to marry Belle because she's a commoner and he's a prince, and can you think of the scandal? It's like, he was just a beast and now he's not. Have a little gratitude, lady. We find out that the very complicated backstory has the queen going to war for over a decade after her husband dies and putting her infant son in the hands of a very powerful but sort of sketch fairy, different fairy, because there's more than one, because why not? And this fairy, being super creepy, decides that she has fallen in love with the literal baby she's raised to a young man and is going to marry him now. And when the queen is like, no, that's creepy, what are you thinking? She curses them both. And so this whole thing is that the beast has to be cold and cruel and stupid, because if anyone ever finds out who he is, the curse is forever. And there's actually at one point where he is on the verge of telling Belle anyway, and the fairy appears behind Belle and threatens silently to kill her unless he keeps his mouth shut. And so he does. But the revelations are not done, because it turns out that Belle is not a commoner. No, in classic fairy tale fashion, she's actually a princess and higher ranking than the prince because her mother's actually from the fairy court. Because why not? So Belle and the prince are finally allowed to wed, happily ever after, la-di-da. Yeah, and that's the short version. There are so many needless digressions and B-plots and characters. You're like, why do I care about any of this? So the movie was a huge hit in theaters with tons of memorable characters and catchy tunes that do not show up anywhere in the original. As you can now see, Disney also cut a lot of backstory and world building out of the story, and I agree with them for once. There's a whole aside about fairy hierarchies and how you have to go up in the hierarchy by turning yourself into a serpent for a while, and if you do this multiple times, you can move up, but otherwise it's age-based, it's very complex and needless. On the plus side, the 2017 live-action remake did manage to plug some of the most egregious plot holes from the animated version, and there are some doozies. So the one that always bothered me was Prince Adam's age in the animated movie. The Enchantress gives him until his 21st birthday to find true love. We learned from the furniture during Be Our Guest they've all been ensorcelled and refusing and rusting for 10 years, which means Adam was 11. So she knocked on his door, and being a child, he said no. We also have the whole question of how does the Beast have a portrait of himself as an adult that he has never seen before? Why is this not a picture of a child? So then I can't really blame a child for not letting a stranger in the house, even though he's a royal stranger. And also, does that mean Chip has been a child his entire life? Does that mean he's been a cop his entire life? What is going on with Chip? I am so confused. That kid is going to need a lot of therapy. The 2017 live-action remake fixes this particular plot hole by actually showing the prince as an adult refusing entry to the Enchantress, and then eliminating any specific number of years. We've been like this for a while. We don't remember. Sometime. Instead of a child not letting a stranger in the house, especially since both of his parents appear to be mysteriously dead of fairy tale disease, this is clearly a noble breaking the rules of guest right, which, as I mentioned, was a major plot point in the original tale. Host had certain duties, and taking in a wandering traveler seeking shelter was a big one. The Greeks had many tales of the gods wandering the country in disguise and asking for shelter. The story is deliberately referencing those stories, especially when the Enchantress warns Prince Adam not to be deceived by appearances and asks again, offering a single rose in payment. He is being punished because he broke those rules and he should have known those rules. That's on him. He's pretty clearly in the wrong in this one, but it's real murky in the animated. This also leads into another thing that always bothered me, namely that the servants did absolutely nothing wrong and got punished anyway. In the original tale, the people of the castle are all turned into incredibly lifelike statues, frozen in space and time until the curse is broken. So no time is going by for them except in the outside world where everyone they knew was dead, but let's not think about that. This was not part of the evil fairy's curse, but additional magic by the good fairy from the end of the queen, because as I mentioned, if anyone found out about the prince, the curse is going to be forever. So all of those people who know about the prince can't be allowed to talk. And the fairy was originally, being a fairy, just going to kill them all. And the queen was like, no, please don't. Please don't kill my subjects. I like them. I'd like to keep them. So the prince is secretly a charming, kind, clever, wonderful man who makes a great husband in the original tale. All of the mean, I'm going to kill you things are things he is explicitly being forced to do. He hates doing all of it. He is deliberately refusing to talk to her as much as possible because he doesn't want to slip up and give away that he's actually really kind and smart and charming and funny, because that's not how magic works. So they also mentioned that they watched Adam's father lash out at a little child Adam after his mother died and did nothing to try to help him. So, and as everyone's in the main chamber, they also see what Adam is doing. They also see the enchantress, and they're also like, yeah, get her out of here. We're having a party. So it's not the strongest justification. It doesn't really deserve what happens to them, but at least there's something. At least they did something. Speaking of the townspeople, the story never really explains how the entire town could have just, like, no idea that there's an enormous castle where the nobility used to live not that long ago. It's been 10 years. You don't forget there used to be a prince there 10 years ago. People would definitely have questions about the sudden disappearance of the local lords. Everyone seems utterly shocked by the idea of a castle out in the woods when Maurice mentions it, but you'd think someone would have checked in at some point, if only to pay taxes or to petition or something. In the original story, this is explained as part of the Good Fairy spell. She enchants the grounds to be impossible for anyone else to find unless they are chosen to try and break the curse. The Good Fairy is Belle's aunt, and is always intended for her to marry the prince, so she's explicitly the reason that Belle's father is able to find it. Given the whole thing in the live action with the lightning striking a tree that is later found to be whole and the snow that is happening here but not there, it's implied that this is what's going on, that it's fairy magic making this whole thing hard to find. You've also got in the animated, Gaston seems like he has no trouble at all leading the townspeople straight to the castle that he's never been to and no one knew existed until 10 minutes ago. But it's a rocking song, so I try not to think about it too hard. It's a great song. 2017 fixes this by borrowing the mass enchantment idea. The people who flee the castle in time have their memories wiped of everything, even their missing families, which is real sad. So it isn't explicitly explained, but maybe it was to give the prince a fighting chance, because if everyone's like, oh yeah, that prince, he's a jerk, they're probably not going to get him to fall in love and be loved in return and la-di-da-di-da. Which he still almost blows by being a huge jerk. So, the other question is it a good love story? And that's a good question. We get to this is one of the thornier issues. Is the love story between Belle and the Beast something to root for, or is it a problematic case of Stockholm Syndrome? As you might expect, audiences and critics are divided on this. In both Disney versions of the story, the Villeneuve original and the de Beaumont rewrite, Belle first meets the Beast under terrible duress. In the former, she volunteers for a lifetime prison sentence in her father's place for the apparent crime of plucking a rose, which is a pretty big overreaction. In the latter, she fully expects to be executed in her father's place for the same transgression, although this Beast isn't actually angry, and it's all fairy magic and manipulation and smoke and mirrors. Either way, Belle begins her interactions with the Beast as a prisoner with no hope of escape. She then proceeds to spend months alone in the castle with him and either a merry band of anthropomorphic furniture playing matchmaker or a menagerie of performing monkeys and singing birds, which we didn't get to because there's so much. During her long period of isolation, she and the Beast develop a rapport and eventually a relationship that culminates in marriage by the end of the tale. Disney does have a long history of inactive princess characters in their animated films, so it's not hard to see how Belle fits into this lineage, but the issue didn't start with the House of Mouse. We talked about Cinderella last year, and I mentioned then how the Brothers Grimm, who provided the source material for a lot of the Disney fairy tales, did their heroines very dirty. They actively did not like strong women and had a nasty habit of editing their stories to make them super passive. So in the original Cinderella, she has 14 lines of dialogue in the first version and is down to only 6 by the final version they published. Disney followed this trend, leaving poor Cinderella as fairly passive and waiting for her fairy godmother to do all the heavy lifting. Lucky for the plucky Belle, the Grimms never got their hands on her. Belle is a woman written by women. Both the 18th century stories come from female authors, and the 1991 animated film was penned by Linda Wolverton, giving Belle a much more active role in her story. The original story was specifically intended for an audience of young French girls, which informs the narrative. The intention was to show that arranged marriages weren't necessarily as frightening as they seemed. For context, de Villeneuve was a part of a powerful Protestant family in a very Catholic France. She married into a noble family and regretted it almost immediately. Her husband squandered most of their joint inheritance within 6 months, and she requested a separation of property from him since he was clearly wildly irresponsible. She was widowed at 26 and now broke. She was forced to find a job to support herself. She ended up falling in love with a famous writer of tragedies and cohabitated with him without marrying again a few years before publishing her famous story. This helps to explain why, in her story, Belle falls in love with her dream prince, not the beast. In fact, she never loved the beast. But having lived with him for a time, she realizes he will make for a good husband and a good life. She doesn't come to this decision until after being allowed to return to her home village and getting hit on by all the young men who each claim to be desperately in love with her sisters yesterday. They are all young and handsome and charming, unlike the beast, but they would also be terrible partners. There's no passion with the beast, but there's respect, stability, and genuine affection, if not love. And given to Villeneuve's personal history, that was far preferable. This trend continued with de Beaumont's rewrite, which, in a bit of shady shenanigans, she did not credit de Villeneuve in. She sometimes gets credited as the original version because of this, but she's not. She separated from her first husband after a series of infidelities, working as a teacher and a governess. Her experiences led her to double down on the message of settling for a boring but supportive relationship. With arranged marriages being very much not in vogue in modern American culture, this nuance has been lost. Even in the Disney version, Belle doesn't develop feelings for the beast until after he frees her to save her father. Per the terms of their original bargain, the beast has no obligation to do this. She certainly had a chance to see that the beast isn't just his temper, which is still very problematic, make no mistake. He risked his life to save her from the wolves after she fled the castle in response to his anger. It's definitely the smart move on Belle's part and a much more active choice than most of her Disney princess predecessors would have made. This sacrifice, coupled with the kindness showed to the furniture courtiers, convinces Belle that Beast isn't all terrible. But it's not until he frees her from her promise to save her father that she develops feelings. By this point, she understands his situation and knows that he is putting her happiness above himself, doing the work to be introspective. Particularly in comparison to Gaston, the handsome, self-absorbed jerk who acts as a stand-in for the terrible husbands both of them suffered through. The Beast is looking like a much more valid option. In the live action, Belle observes that she's already met everyone in the village and no one is a good match. Don't get me wrong, this is still a pretty dysfunctional relationship with a lot of deeply problematic elements that harken back to the arranged marriage message of the original, but I don't think it's Stockholm Syndrome. In the original tale, the Beast goes out of his way early on to provide for Belle and her family way above and beyond what is obligated. Remember, she came to the castle fully expecting to be executed. So when her captor offers her father an enormous trunk full of treasure, they assume it's a weregild, a blood price. As the story goes on, you discover that it's much more of a dowry, and a heavy one at that. This was cut out of the film since to modern audiences where the tradition of the dowry has mostly vanished, it kind of plays like Beast is buying Belle. The Beast in the fairy tale is never anything but kind to Belle, at least once you get past the threats of execution, but, what you gonna do? To Beast's credit, it truly wasn't his fault in the original story. He literally is being threatened with her death if he doesn't comply. It also changes things a bit when at the very end of the fairy tale, de Villeneuve reveals that the prince doesn't have an anger issue at all, and only participated in the manipulative farce under literal threats. He's a legitimate good person who's been forced into a bad situation. He's forced into the role of the royal trapped in a magic castle, waiting to be freed by an outside force, namely the very proactive Belle, who has a surprising amount of agency for a fairy tale. At the very least, the story provides a good vehicle for discussing consent, as well as healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics. Now, what most people don't realize is it's actually based on a true story. I already mentioned that it was heavily influenced by the romantic woes of the authors, but it was also inspired by the true story of Petrus Gonçalves, who was born Pedro Gonzalez in 1537 in the Canary Islands, which were controlled by Spain at the time. He was born with a genetic condition known as hypertrichosis, which is sometimes colloquially known as werewolf syndrome, because it causes significant hair growth in different parts of the body, often the face. In Petrus's case, he grew significant hair across his entire body. Unfortunately for him, the Spanish treated the hairy man from the distant island as a sideshow curiosity. He was captured, thrown in an iron cage, fed raw meat, and brought to France for the coronation of Henry II in 1547. Things took a turn for the better when Petrus arrived. King Henry didn't agree with the awful treatment of the so-called wild man who, despite his deplorable conditions, was calm and collected. The king decided to try educating the young man to transform him into a proper gentleman. They changed his name to the Latin version of his birth name. He was taught to read, write, and speak 3 languages, and then given all the education expected of a French noble. The court was impressed by the incredible progress, granting him an incredible amount of status for a man who was kidnapped and brought to the continent naked and in a cage. Even so, most of them really didn't see him as human, and he remained royal property. After Henry II was killed in a jousting match in 1559, he became the property of the king's widow, Catherine de' Medici, who ascended to the throne in her own right. She decided to one-up her now-dead husband and experiment by marrying the noble beast off to a beautiful woman. Would their children also be, quote-unquote, little beasts? She found the daughter of a royal court servant, coincidentally also named Catherine, who would be arranged for this marriage. It all ties together. The couple met for the first time on their wedding day. Much like the heroine she inspired, she was not prepared for what she was about to be married to. But she took it all in stride, saw the kind man beneath the hairy exterior, and decided to proceed with it because it didn't bother her. They went ahead with the marriage as planned and eventually had 7 children, 4 of whom did also have hypertrichosis. And this is a painted portrait of our esteemed Petrus and Catherine. They were married for the rest of their lives, another 40 years or so, and toured Europe before eventually settling down in Parma, Italy, where they were owned by the Duke Rannuccio Farnese. In a terrible twist of the knife, the Duke tore the family apart, sending the 4 hairy children to favored noble families to become pets. Ew. So to wrap this whole thing up, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the more interesting and out-there adaptations of Beauty and the Beast. So, one of the more interesting versions is the short story collection, The Bloody Chamber, by Angela Carter from 1979, which has not 1 but 2 different retellings of the tale. These versions take a very deliberate modern take at the old stories to tease out thoughts about love, marriage, and fidelity. 1, The Courtship of Mr. Lion, focuses on growing into adulthood and sexual awakening from the perspective of a young girl known as Beauty. Over the course of the story, Beauty finds herself drawn to the savage beauty of the Beast. By the time she returns to live with her father again, she thinks of herself as a woman, transforming into adulthood even as the Beast transforms into his human form. The other, The Tiger's Bride, is narrated by Belle herself. This version is not an innocent girl, but a tough, wise woman made hard by a hard life in the frigid north. She is angry with her father for losing her to a masked man in a game of cards, because who wouldn't be? Her new captor offers her a single white rose, which she shreds in fury. Unlike the other versions, Belle has not chosen to become a captive in this tale. The usually pure symbols of snow and white roses are torn to pieces or tainted with blood. It is Belle who is cruel, treating the Beast as something less than human. She eventually discovers that he is actually a tiger, pretending to be human. She accepts him for who he is and transforms herself into a tiger as well, rather than the Beast into a human, and they go off to be wild, savage tigers. It's a very cool inversion of the usual trope. If you're about my age, you might also remember the very strange television series from 1987 with Linda Hamilton as the New York City attorney and Ron Perlman as Vincent, the lion-faced beast who lives in the sewers. It was a fever dream. I don't know if it was a good show per se, but it was memorable. So one of the most interesting adaptations of the source material was 2021's anime simply titled Belle. It does a fantastic story of taking an old story and translating it into the near future in a way that offers a fresh take on the same themes. Much of the movie takes place in an online virtual reality, allowing for some truly incredible visuals while keeping the characters firmly rooted in reality. I won't go into too much detail on this to avoid spoilers because it is absolutely worth a watch. So if you haven't seen it, you absolutely should. Make sure you get the dubbed version unless you speak Japanese. The movie centers on the 17-year-old introvert Suzu, whose name translates to Little Bell, Bell, which is a fun little pun that the writers are playing with. She's struggling in the wake of her mother's tragic death years before. She turns to the digital universe, known simply as You, to escape from her awful struggles at school and her difficulty with social anxiety. You is populated by a dazzling array of fantastical avatars and offers an interesting perspective on how the anonymity of the internet frees people to either be better or, more often, far crueler and more hurtful. She meets a rogue fighter from the martial arts circles of You, fleeing from a self-appointed group of superhero wannabes known as Justice. And this particular much abused fighter is simply known as the Dragon or the Beast. Their shared desire for a real human connection, coupled with their powerful fear of being hurt, gives the whole story a very honest core that I thoroughly enjoyed. So absolutely check it out. It's got some incredible musical numbers, just absolutely stunning visuals. It is a very, very cool movie. So at this point, I want to open up the floor to any Q&A about Beauty and the Beast, mythology more in general, or anything you want to ask, because why not? I'm here.
So I guess my question is more about fairies and kind of the lore of, or I don't want to say the etymology, but how they came about in terms of, I guess, French mythology or the original writing.
Oh, how the fairies got involved in the French mythology? Yeah, the Celtic people and the also the Gaelic peoples both heavily had fairies, some of which had been adopted from the Norse traditions and then reimagined as they've spread out and extended. The Celts and the Gauls both were heavily based in France at the time, up until the expansion of the Roman Empire around was that about the turn of the 0 AD BC fun things. With Julius Caesar and his Gallic campaigns up in France. It eventually gets ruled into the Roman Empire and then gets corrupted into the more European folklores. So you get that mix of different cultures thanks to the very cosmopolitan Roman Empire. But it's taking influences from the Norse, from the Gauls, from the Celts, and from the other peoples who encountered the Roman Empire.
So do you know how much? Oh, sorry. Let me get lower here. Do you know how much of the day-to-day, either I guess in this case, French citizens would have an understanding of these tales, and how much would they believe in it, or use it more as like a morality tale to teach children about respect or what their place was in society? Because I know with the Greeks, eventually towards the end, they less believed and more said, "Well, this is our culture. We're Hellenic. We're just going to praise it because of that."
Yeah, it's definitely a mix, particularly when you start getting into the fairy tales. Most of those are either hyper real versions of real events that have been twisted by time and by retellings, but in a lot of cases, they were explicitly written as morality tales. That's what the Brothers Grimm were doing. They were writing morality tales for adults. De Villeneuve and de Beaumont were both writing morality tales for like teenagers. They were intended as education. So most cases they were not really believed, but you do have some of the older tales that hung on from the more classical traditions where those stories were a hyper real version that got mixed in with the real history. Like you mentioned the Greeks, some of the real story of Troy, which is a real battle that really happened at a real place that we finally found, gets mixed in with the gods and these hyper heroes to tell a story that's different from the original and becomes its own thing.
I wondered if you had heard the kind of critical analysis of the animated Beauty and the Beast being so different from the original, because instead of drawing so heavily on the Cupid Psyche kind of arranged marriage idea, it draws much more from the Pride and Prejudice, bickering, slap, slap, kiss kind of deal for the modern audiences.
Yeah, I've definitely seen a couple think pieces on that, and they make some very good points. And you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're very much drawing much more from the renaissance of romance stories that had come into its own around the late '80s and early '90s, where you start seeing more Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen revival, as well as I was mentioning, The Bloody Chamber, which is also very much a heavy influence on that reimagining of the story from a different perspective and not looking at it from centuries ago, which Disney had been trying to do already. You already had a couple from the golden age where they were trying to make the story more updated and make the princesses not just passive figures who show up. And I think this is where they really started to hit their stride, started to see those pieces.
And the John Cocteau version too, from
Say again?
the John Cocteau movie from the 40s.
I'm not sure I know that. Could you give us an explanation?
Well, that's the one where a lot of like the candelabras and the Gaston character comes
Mhm.
from.
Okay.
So it's the French version.
Oh, I did not realize that. Well, thank you. I appreciate learning that.
Would you consider the Phantom of the Opera a remake of it?
The Phantom of the Opera would have been the original would have been written somewhat contemporaneously with it, and I think it is extremely likely that yes, he would have known about this fairy tale. It was an extremely popular tale at the time. It would have been all over the courts of Paris. So I don't know if I would say it's a remake, but he would have been heavily influenced both by this tale as well as they were both influenced by Cupid and Psyche, which is a story they're both very heavily telling. Uh, you've definitely got Christine is very much a Psyche stand-in. This idea of the human soul who is its own thing. She's the desire, the beauty of art, this music given form. And so I think it's more that they're both influenced by the same source material.
Okay.
Hi. You spoke at the beginning about how the original story and the original source material kind of went into these like rabbit holes and delving into some extreme like character building and world building that we didn't necessarily need. I'm thinking about that in relation to the Disney Broadway production of their animated movie, and how they kind of added in some new songs, and you got some more world building and more character development. Thinking specifically of the Human Again song about the characters in the castle, and then the Beast song where you really got to kind of know his personality through song. Where do you draw the line from important world building and character development to rabbit holes that nobody needs to go down?
Yeah, that's always really, really tricky, particularly when you get into the older stories. They did not see stories the same way we did. They were often live orated stories where it was call and response. They were meant to be things that the audiences sort of knew and they were playing on it. You could have common themes that you would give new spins on. And so these rabbit holes were a way of keeping these stories fresh so that you weren't hearing the same story you were always hearing in the past. So when you start trying to adapt these stories, it becomes really tricky. For instance, if you go into, like, say, the Iliad, there are pages and pages of pages that are just lists of treasure that different people acquired, or different people who got into a race, and this is the order that they came in, which means nothing to us. But the people who were listening, this was their lineage. Each of these people, one of these families, that's who they claim as their patriarch. That's who they drew the lineage. And so it was a fun way for bringing the audience in and making them feel like this is a part of your story. This is a part of your history. And so when you're adapting those stories, you have to think about what the modern audience wants to hear. What is the story you want to tell? And does this rabbit hole help, or does it just make you go, I don't know what's going on anymore? Because as much as I love in the original tale, she has these monkeys who are perfect actors and pantomimers who act as her butlers in her little suits. And it's honestly pretty adorable. And they have these little birds who can sing operas and arias, and they have parrots that speak. And so the parrots hide in little wigs on the monkeys, and they do these whole shows with the birds providing the speech as the monkeys perform these shows. And it's worthless, but it's fantastic. And so that's sort of like, you get the reimagining of that where they go, well, that's a lot of needless character development. So instead, we're just going to make that Lumiere. We're going to make that all of the Cogsworth. We're going to make that all of the other characters that are already there, rather than introducing a whole new pantheon of characters for no real reason. So it's to answer your original question, eh?
Thank you.
Hey, there was a movie version of the Beauty and Beast story that I saw that had a very different reason for why he became a beast, and I didn't know where it came from. So, like, he was originally like a king,
Mhm.
and his wife was the daughter of a forest god, and she would occasionally turn into a white doe and go running through the woods. But she didn't tell her husband that, and he was obsessed with killing this doe, no matter how many times she asked him not to go hunt it. And then one day he shoots her. She turns back to his wife, and the forest god comes down and is like, "That's not cool," and turns him into a beast. It has elements of the whole freezing his servants, but they turn into these giant statues that animate anytime somebody tries to come to his castle. It's very weird. But I was not sure where that came from.
Yeah, they're definitely pulling that from classical mythology. There are a number of stories. In fact, that's a whole story trope. When you get into, when you really start going into the weeds on mythology and folklore, they have divided up different kinds of stories that they have numbered different archetypes, and that is one of them. The queen married to a king who she has a secret animal transformation that she doesn't want revealed, but somehow the king becomes obsessed with hunting that version. And it shows up a lot. It's also a variation on an older story from Greek mythology wherein Artemis is bathing in the woods and a hunter accidentally stumbles upon her or tries to stumble upon her or is a friend of hers who is hunting and goes where he's not supposed to. There are like 5 or 6 different versions of what happens, but he then gets turned into a hind or a stag and is then hunted by his own hounds. And so that's one of the, there's a couple different versions with different gods. The great god Pan has also done variations of that where he's either someone has been turned into an animal to escape him and then he tries to chase them and they get away or not. There's a lot of Greek mythology that ties into that theme, and that's probably where they're getting that from.
Gotta get in my morning workouts, guys. So the beautiful thing about mythology to me is it's always a window into not necessarily the history of the past, but where our morality and our purview would what we're aspiring to, what our gods and goddesses we're trying to be. We live in an era filled with stories now with gods and goddesses and fantastical creatures and beasts and things. When does that enter the pantheon of mythology? Because this story right now is a 200 plus story, but you can obviously pull from the Greek or Fey or Celtic roots from there. All the stories now are still technically that, but at the same token, we reference Superman, Batman as points of conversation, and everybody understands what we mean by that. So where do you think that line lives? And of course, when we fail as civilization, have to bring it up again. Well, we all look at Superman t-shirts and be like, we must have praised the S.
I mean, very much possible. Yeah, if we move far enough into the future and people are going back and digging through our rubbish heaps because anthropologists love rubbish heaps, yeah, I could absolutely see someone finding old comics and finding old memorabilia, particularly like little statues and the bobbleheads, and being like, "Oh, these must have been their gods." But as you mentioned, there is a lot of these versions are tellings of history that we do have. These are real stories somewhere back. There is some grain of truth in all of these. For instance, you look at, and even if it's just a question of this is something that speaks to the human spirit, like the idea of the mythic hero being a trope that shows up in cultures that never interacted with each other, because we as humans desire this idea of a hero who has to go out and do something scary and learn from it and come back and be changed by that experience because it's a thing we've all experienced. Or like Cinderella, which is one of the oldest stories in existence, all the way back to like 500 BC is the oldest written version we have, and we know it's older than that. And they appear in dozens of cultures because, again, this idea of a good person who was doesn't have a good life by not their fault, getting what they deserve is something we want as people to be true. We don't think it's true, but we want it to be. And so superheroes very much fill that niche now. They are the modern demigods, the modern morality tales. They let us project our our power fantasies of being empowered, or our morality tales of with great power comes great responsibility. It lets us play with those same questions in a way that is just removed enough that we can feel comfortable discussing it, but in a way that is still relatable enough that, like you said, we can keep discussing it. We can talk back about it. We can all understand what you mean when you talk about it. And so I think it very much fills that same need and that same niche as mythology used to. And I think that's part of the reason why mythology video games are such a popular genre now, is because they do, well, one, you can have mythology comes with its own backstory, its own characters. You can not have to do all of that world building. The characters will do that for you, but also it gives you a place to ask those questions and those, what does it mean to be human things? Yes.
So if I remember correctly, through the original Cupid and Psyche myth, there's some candle wax-based shenanigans. Cupid gets taken away, and she has to like prove herself to get him back. Why was this portion of the story taken out of our more modern Beauty and the Beast?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, in the original version, Cupid falls in love with Psyche and accidentally pricks himself with his own arrow and falls in love with her. The whole thing. She ends up at the castle, but she can't see him because he doesn't want anyone knowing she's dating a god, because his mom doesn't know, and his mom is pretty jealous. But she ends up being convinced by her sisters in a classic trope that she is being tricked by a monster, and she needs to make sure that he is what he says he is, because if he's not, she's going to get eaten by this monster. So she takes an oil lamp, goes in to check on him, and finds out, oh no, he's beautiful. Oh, he's gorgeous. And she gets so distracted looking at how beautiful he is that she forgets about her lamp and spills some hot oil on him. At which point you tie back into the Greek mythology themes of having transgressed against the gods. She has violated the guest right. She has been given one specific rule that she agreed not to violate. And by violating that, she is now out of the graces of the gods. Whereas with Belle, you never have Belle violate the graces. That's all a thing. She is, from start to finish, she is a good person who does the right thing, does the hard thing, because she is a good person. She is the only person who is pure enough of heart to have broken the curse. And so she does not need to transgress. The closest she comes with that is you have her almost forgetting about the beast and coming back right a day or two before he would have died. And her transgression, her version of that, is having to claw her way through the thorns, leaving herself bloody and scratched and bleeding. So you have a much smaller version of that. You don't have the full series of tests, which that gets rolled into Cinderella.
I remember
the test
that from
Cinderella.
last year.
And so that may have also been a little bit the author knowing that Cinderella borrowed those tests and wanting to do something different. So it didn't seem like a Cinderella retelling.
Mm-hmm.
So that might have been also part of why she chose a different test.
Okay, thank you.
I have a very simple question.
Okay.
Do you have a personal favorite retelling of the Beauty and the Beast story?
Ooh, favorite retelling of Beauty and the Beast? I mean, honestly, right now, Belle is my favorite retelling. It is. I watched it for this panel a couple months ago, and I loved it. I was just enraptured. It's incredibly relatable characters. It's really cool social commentary. It's just beautiful visuals. I really found the way the different characters interact very interesting. That is probably the one that is currently my favorite.
I agree. Thank you.
I ended up renting it on Amazon Prime, I believe is where it was where I got it. I think it's available for rent in a couple places. For as long as that still exists, yes. All right, so we are coming to the end of this panel as it is. So thank you all for attending. I really appreciate this. Please remember to rate and review this panel on the app. It lets them know that there were people here and they should bring me back, because that's how I get to keep coming back, and I like being here. I've got stickers up here, cards up here. There's a barcode on the back that takes you to the podcast. You can get listen very easily. And yeah. Thank you.